to introduce you to watercolor today. I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about paper and brushes. When we use watercolor, we want to use brushes that are really soft and fluffy. These hold a lot of water. You can see they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I'm going to talk to you about those right now. When you're covering a large space, you want to use a brush like this that's very large. It can hold a lot of water and a lot of pigment. This one is a flat brush. It's really good for getting smooth strokes. This one is a round brush. You can see it's sort of pointed at the tip. It's larger, but it comes to a small point, so it can give you some variability in your brush strokes. This is an angle brush. You can see that the bristles are short on one end and they're long on the other, so it comes to a point. It's very similar to a flat brush, but it has that point. We have small brushes that are good for detail work. This is a fan brush, and this helps to create different kinds of textures. And a toothbrush. Toothbrushes don't hold a lot, but they're really cool for splattering, and I will demonstrate that soon. When we're working with watercolor, we also want to think about the paper that we use. We have special watercolor paper, and you can see it's very stiff and thick. It comes in different kinds of surfaces. So there is a rough press, which gives you kind of a rough surface that can give you kind of an added texture. There's cold press, which is smoother than that, and it's sort of the medium level. And then hot press, which is very, very smooth. Next, I'd like to introduce you to the different kinds of watercolor options we have in our classroom. Watercolor pencils start out just like colored pencils, but then when you add water to them, they get that paint-like feel. Similarly, we have watercolor crayons, which you can color just like you would color with crayons, and then add water on top with a brush, and it makes it nice and smooth. And we also have palettes of watercolor cakes. These are sort of semi-dry, so before we use the water with them, I can touch it and nothing comes off on my finger, and as we add water to it, it sort of makes a puddle. And we'll talk about how we use each of these. When you are working with these different kinds of paints, there are different ways to work with them. When you have a watercolor crayon, which is something like this, you'll know that it's a watercolor crayon because it says water-soluble wax pastel. You can, if you color really firm or if you color really light, you can get different amounts of saturation for that color. You can see they come in different colors. So if I wanted to blend my colors together, I could overlap some of that coloring and give myself a different mixture there. With the watercolor pencils, I can do the same thing. If I start, if I color really hard in one area, I'm going to get a lot of pigment, and if I color lightly, I'm going to get less pigment. I can do the same thing where I overlap different colors together. And I can get really detailed in my drawing. It's nice if you can color in sort of the same direction as you're coloring, because if you get kind of scribbly with it, you're going to end up with that little bit of that texture left behind. So you can think about how that will add to your painting. So the next step would be to start out with one of your watercolor brushes. I'm going to select something that is not very large and has a little point on the end. I'm going to get my brush wet in my water, so you can see I'm dipping it into my water here. Get my water, and I can start painting over this with just clean water, and it sort of will spread more than where I painted it originally, but you can see where I colored it lightly, it has less pigment, where it's sort of mixing here in the middle, and where it has the heaviest coloring, it has the darkest color. That's what we call saturation. If I paint over this, if I want to preserve this texture a little bit, I can kind of color over it in the same way, and then you can see I'm getting variable high and low saturation points. I can even take this and create like a new painting over here. If I've written words like this, I can color right over them with that water, and it's going to make it look smooth and painterly. The more water I use, the more I can eliminate the texture that you see behind here. So you can see I didn't really paint over this section very much, and so I still see some of the texture of the crayon left behind. If I paint over that more, I can make that texture go away. Because it leaves that texture, that is definitely an option for contributing to the kind of feel that you create in your painting. Just exactly the same over here with the pencils. You can see that as I paint over them, I can get that painterly feel. I can eliminate some of that texture. The colored pencils are not quite as saturated as the crayons are, but that can give you sort of a lighter feel, which is kind of nice. Over here, if I color over this, it does stay in place a little bit more than the crayon does. So if I paint over this just smooth, I don't have to follow around the texture, and the texture will still be left behind unless I go over it several times. But I don't want to do that too much because I don't want to rip the paper, and the more I paint over in the same spot over and over and over again, it will start to loosen the tooth on this paper. Again, with words, because these stay in place a little bit more, if I wanted to just paint over it like that, then it gives a little bit more of that painterly feel with the water being added there. You can see it kind of stays in place better, the pencil, than the crayon would. If I go over with the water with the crayon, it blends it a lot more, creates a lot more in the background. We'll talk about our pan set in the next video.